The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed faintly as Eric Lockhart adjusted the settings on his worn-out tablet, its cracked screen reflecting the labyrinthine blueprints of the air ducts. He was knee-deep in his third service call of the day, which felt exactly like the first two, dull, uneventful, and monotonous. Life as a Level C maintenance technician at the Harrison Research Facility wasn't glamorous. He often joked to himself that he was the janitor of things that didn't need mopping. "Another day, another clogged vent," he muttered, his voice echoing faintly in the empty corridor. His humor was his coping mechanism, even if it often went unappreciated. Humor, after all, didn't make government-grade air purifiers any less complicated. The facility had always creeped him out. A sprawling complex buried beneath 50 feet of concrete and secrecy, it had an air of ominous grandeur. Everyone walked around tight-lipped, nodding curtly at one another, but rarely stopping to chat. Eric wasn't privy to what exactly they were researching here, and he was smart enough not to ask. Whatever was going on above his pay grade was none of his business, and that was just fine. His job was to fix things, not solve mysteries. At least, that's what he thought until he found the door. The job order had said something about a ventilation failure in subsection D, an area Eric had only been to once before during his training. It was a restricted zone, typically reserved for scientists, guards, and people with shiny badges and no time to explain themselves. But the ticket had come through, and protocol dictated that maintenance issues needed immediate attention. He strolled down the long, sterile hallway, humming an off-key rendition of Staying Alive to stave off the creeping silence. His boots clacked against the tile floor as he scanned the wall for the right panel. That's when he noticed it, a steel door, unmarked and slightly ajar. Eric paused, narrowing his eyes. Every door in the facility was labeled, numbered, or locked tight. This one? It was none of the above. "Well, that's not ominous at all," he muttered. Against his better judgment, he poked his head through the opening. The room beyond was dimly lit, the glow from various monitors casting flickering shadows across the walls. The air felt colder here, with a faint metallic tang that tickled the back of his throat. Rows of machines beeped and whirred softly, their functions inscrutable. And in the center of it all was her. Eric froze, his breath catching in his throat. At first, he thought it was some sort of art installation, an elaborate experiment in robotics or holography. But no, the figure in the chair was undeniably alive. She was humanoid, but not human, at least not entirely. Her skin shimmered like molten silver, catching the light in a way that seemed almost fluid. Her limbs were long and graceful, her movements minimal but deliberate, and her eyes. They were unlike anything Eric had ever seen. They glowed faintly, a soft bluish-white light, like distant stars on a clear night. She was restrained, her wrists and ankles bound by cuffs that emitted a low, steady hum. Tubes snaked from her arms to the surrounding machines, and the monitors displayed readings Eric couldn't begin to understand. For a long moment, Eric simply stared, his mind racing to catch up. This wasn't just above his pay grade. This was another galaxy entirely. She turned her head slowly, her gaze locking onto his. It wasn't just a look. It was a connection, raw and electric. Eric felt something stir in his chest, a mix of awe, fear, and a strange, inexplicable sadness. Hi, he managed to croak, raising a hand awkwardly. Humor had always been his defense mechanism, and old habits died hard. "You don't look like you're on the maintenance schedule." Her head tilted slightly, a gesture that felt more curious than threatening. Her eyes flickered, scanning him with an intensity that made him feel like he was the one under the microscope. Eric took a hesitant step forward, his instincts warring with his common sense. This was insane. He should leave, report this, pretend he'd never seen it, but the way she looked at him, there was something undeniably human about it, a silent plea that cut through his fear. "I'm guessing you don't want to be here," he said softly, his voice steadier now. She didn't respond, but he didn't expect her to. Still, there was something in her expression, a subtle softening, that felt like agreement. Eric glanced around the room, his eyes landing on the control panel nearest to her. He didn't know exactly what he was looking at, but it wasn't hard to spot the lock's controls. A few keystrokes, a couple of overrides, and he could release her. Or he could walk away. The rational part of his brain screamed at him to do the latter, but Eric had never been one to follow the rules. Rules were what had landed him in this dead-end job, fixing air ducts for people who barely acknowledged his existence. Rules didn't make the world better, they just kept it orderly. And this felt bigger than rules. "All right," he said, stepping closer. "Let's see if I can figure this out without accidentally blowing us both up." It took longer than he would have liked, mostly because the interface wasn't exactly user-friendly, and Eric's grasp of alien technology was, unsurprisingly, non-existent. But after a few tense minutes, the cuffs released with a soft hiss. She stood slowly, her movements deliberate as if testing her newfound freedom. Up close, she was even more stunning, her presence almost overwhelming. "You're free," Eric said, taking a cautious step back. "So, you're welcome?" For a moment, she simply stared at him, her expression unreadable. Then, to his surprise, she raised a hand, touching her chest lightly, before extending it toward him. A gesture of gratitude, perhaps? Eric nodded, his throat suddenly dry. "Yeah, sure, anytime." Before he could say anything else, she moved, fast and silent, like a shadow slipping through the door. By the time Eric gathered his wits enough to follow, she was gone. He stood in the empty hallway, his heart pounding. "Well," he muttered to himself, a shaky grin creeping onto his face. "That's going to look great on my performance review." The alarm blared through the facility, a low, throbbing wail that seemed to vibrate in Eric's bones. He ran, not because he had a plan or even the faintest idea of where he was going, but because staying put seemed like an objectively terrible idea. "Brilliant, Eric," he muttered under his breath as he ducked into an empty corridor, his voice nearly drowned out by the sirens. "You couldn't just stick to unclogging vents, could you? No, you had to go and liberate the alien prisoner. Great career move. Really top-notch decision-making." The hallways all looked the same, long stretches of sterile white tile broken only by the occasional flicker of fluorescent light. Somewhere behind him, the rhythmic thud of boots echoed closer, and Eric's stomach churned. Facility guards, no doubt armed to the teeth and deeply uninterested in hearing his side of the story. He skidded to a stop at an intersection, the soles of his boots squealing against the floor. Left or right? Both options looked equally bad, but the sound of approaching footsteps made the decision for him. He darted right, his heart pounding so loudly he swore it could set off another alarm. "This is fine," he whispered to himself, his voice tinged with hysteria. "Everything's fine, just a little jailbreak. Happens all the time, right? Totally normal Tuesday." A sudden movement ahead made him freeze. At first he thought it was one of the guards, but no, the figure stepping out of the shadows wasn't wearing a uniform. It was her. The alien woman moved with an eerie grace, her silvery skin reflecting the faint red glow of the emergency lights. She glanced at him, her luminous eyes flickering with what Eric could only describe as irritation. "Oh, great," he said, throwing his hands up. "You're annoyed with me now. I just risked my job, my life, thank you very much, to get you out of here." She didn't respond, of course. Instead, she gestured sharply, pointing down another hallway. "What, you want me to follow you?" Eric asked, incredulous. "You realize I'm not exactly the heroic escapee type, right? I'm more of a hide in a closet and hope for the best kind of guy." Her glowing eyes narrowed, and for a moment, Eric could have sworn her expression said, "Do you ever stop talking?" Okay, he said, raising his hands in mock surrender. "Lead the way, Your Highness." She took off without waiting to see if he followed, her movements quick and purposeful. Eric scrambled after her, muttering under his breath about how this was probably going to get him killed. The next few minutes were a blur of twisting hallways and near misses. Twice, they had to duck into side passages to avoid patrolling guards, and each time Eric found himself holding his breath, his heart threatening to burst out of his chest. The alien woman, by contrast, seemed almost unbothered, her sharp eyes scanning for threats with a calm efficiency that made Eric feel like a nervous wreck by comparison. Eventually, they reached a service hatch at the end of a dimly lit corridor. She stopped, placing a hand against the panel. Her fingers seemed to pulse faintly, and Eric watched in amazement as the hatch unlocked with a quiet hiss. "Okay, seriously," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "What are you? And how are you doing all this? Is it some kind of telekinesis thing, or are you just really good with tech?" She turned to him, her expression unreadable. For a moment he thought she might actually answer, but then she stepped through the hatch without a word. "Right, sure. Don't explain anything," he muttered, following her into the dark. "Why would you? It's not like I've got anything better to do than blindly follow a glowing space lady through a death trap." The hatch led to a maintenance tunnel, the cramped space lined with pipes and wires. It was familiar territory for Eric, though the stakes were considerably higher than his usual unclogging jobs. "Where exactly are we going?" he asked, after a few minutes of tense silence. "Or is that another thing you're not going to tell me?" She glanced back at him, and though she didn't speak, there was something in her gaze that felt almost amused. "Great," he said, shaking his head. "Glad you're enjoying yourself. I'm having a blast." They emerged from the tunnel into what looked like a storage bay. Large crates and equipment were stacked haphazardly, creating plenty of hiding spots, but also plenty of places for guards to ambush them. The alien woman moved quickly, her head tilting slightly, as if she were listening for something Eric couldn't hear. "What's the plan?" he asked, keeping his voice low. "Do you even have a plan, or are we just winging it?" She pointed toward a large door on the far side of the bay. "Of course. The giant, heavily guarded exit," Eric said, sighing. "Because why would we pick the easy way out?" Sure enough, as they moved closer, the sound of voices and heavy boots echoed from the hallway beyond the door. Eric's stomach dropped. "We're so dead," he whispered. The alien woman ignored him, her focus on the control panel beside the door. She pressed her hand against it, and Eric watched in stunned silence as the panel lit up, the door unlocking with a soft click. "Okay," he said, his voice tinged with awe. "That's actually kind of cool." Before he could say anything else, she grabbed his arm, pulling him through the door just as the guards' voices grew louder. They sprinted into the night, the cool air biting at Eric's face. He barely had time to process the fact that they were outside. Really outside, not just in some enclosed courtyard, before the alien woman stopped abruptly, releasing his arm. She turned to him, her glowing eyes meeting his. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then she raised her hand, touching her chest lightly, before extending it toward him in a gesture of gratitude. Eric blinked, his breath visible in the cold air. You're welcome?" She gave him one last look, a mixture of gratitude and something else he couldn't quite place, before turning and disappearing into the darkness. Eric stood there for a long moment, his mind racing. "Well," he said finally, a shaky laugh escaping him. "That's probably going to get me fired." The following morning, Eric Lockhart sat on his second-hand couch, sipping lukewarm coffee out of a mug that read, "World's Okayest Employee." He'd bought it years ago as a joke, but this morning it felt more like a prophecy. His apartment was small, cluttered with the kind of furniture you acquired out of necessity, not taste. The air smelled faintly of burnt toast, and the TV buzzed softly with the local news. He wasn't paying attention to the anchor's cheerful banter or the weather report, though. His mind was a million miles away, or perhaps several light years away, depending on how far she had gone. She, the alien woman. Eric leaned back, letting out a long breath. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw her face, those luminous, star-like eyes, that shimmering silver skin, the way she moved like she was part of some otherworldly ballet. He'd spent most of the night alternating between staring at the ceiling and pacing his apartment, replaying the events at the facility over and over. He should have felt relieved. They'd gotten out after all. The sirens had faded into the night, and no one had shown up to arrest him, yet. But the truth was, he felt more unsettled than anything. He couldn't shake the look she'd given him before she disappeared into the darkness. Gratitude, sure, but there had been something else there too. A question maybe, or a promise. His tablet buzzed on the coffee table, dragging him back to reality. Eric groaned, setting his mug down and picking up the device. The screen lit up with an incoming message from his supervisor at the facility. "Lockhart, where are you?" Eric sighed, running a hand through his hair. Of course, they'd noticed his absence. He was supposed to be on site for his morning shift, but he hadn't exactly been in a hurry to clock in after what had happened. Still, ignoring the message wouldn't make things any better. Not feeling great. Took a sick day. The response came almost immediately. "Come in tomorrow. We need to talk." "Great," Eric muttered, tossing the tablet back onto the table. That's not ominous at all. He stood, stretching and trying to shake off the lingering tension. Maybe he was overthinking it. Maybe the facility didn't know what he'd done. They couldn't possibly have security footage of him unlocking that door, could they? And even if they did, what would they do about it? He was just a low-level maintenance tech, hardly the mastermind type. Still, the unease gnawed at him. The facility wasn't exactly forgiving when it came to mistakes, and Eric had a sinking feeling this particular mistake was going to haunt him. He was about to pour himself another cup of coffee when the knock came. It was soft, almost hesitant, but in the silence of his apartment, it sounded like a gunshot. Eric froze, his heart skipping a beat. Nobody ever came to his door. His neighbors kept to themselves, and the only visitors he ever got were delivery drivers who'd already left by the time he opened up. The knock came again, louder this time. "Okay," Eric muttered under his breath, setting the coffee pot down. "No big deal. Probably just someone selling something. Or maybe it's the landlord wanting to yell at me about the water bill." He moved toward the door, his steps slow and cautious. Peering through the peephole, he blinked in confusion. There was no one there. "Seriously?" he said, frowning. He opened the door a crack, glancing out into the hallway. It was empty, the usual hum of the building's fluorescent lights the only sound. But just as he was about to close the door, something caught his eye. Sitting on the doormat was a small object, glowing faintly in the dim light. Eric crouched down, his curiosity outweighing his caution. The object was about the size of a baseball, smooth and spherical, its surface pulsing with a soft, silvery blue light. It looked almost alive. "What the—" he started to say, but his words trailed off as he picked it up. The moment his fingers touched the surface, he felt a strange warmth, as if the sphere were responding to him. It was then that he noticed something else. Small, faint markings etched into the sphere's surface. They weren't in any language he recognized, but there was something oddly familiar about them, as if they were meant to be understood on a level beyond words. Eric stood, turning the sphere over in his hands. His mind raced with possibilities, none of them comforting. Had she left this for him? And if so, why? He stepped back into his apartment, closing the door behind him and locking it out of instinct. Setting the sphere on the coffee table, he sat down and stared at it, half expecting it to do something dramatic, like explode or start talking. Instead, it simply glowed, its light pulsing in a rhythm that reminded him of a heartbeat. "Okay," he said, running a hand through his hair. "This is fine. Everything's fine. Just a glowing alien thing sitting on my coffee table. Totally normal." He reached for his tablet, his fingers hovering over the search bar. He wasn't sure what he was looking for. How to identify mysterious alien artifacts wasn't exactly a common topic on the internet, but he figured it was worth a shot. Before he could start typing, the sphere emitted a soft hum, and the light grew brighter. Eric jumped, nearly knocking over his coffee mug. Hello?" he said, as if the sphere might answer. The light shifted, forming patterns that danced across its surface. Eric stared, transfixed, as the patterns began to coalesce into something resembling a hologram. It was her. Her image flickered to life above the sphere, a shimmering, ghostly projection. She looked just as he remembered, graceful, otherworldly, her glowing eyes fixed on him with that same mix of curiosity and intensity. Eric's mouth went dry. "You've got to be kidding me." The projection moved, her lips parting as if she were about to speak. But instead of words, a series of melodic tones filled the room, each one resonating in a way that felt more like emotion than sound. I don't understand," Eric said, feeling absurd for talking to what was essentially a glowing baseball. The tones shifted, growing softer, and for a moment, Eric thought he caught the faintest hint of sadness. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the projection vanished, leaving the sphere glowing softly on the table once more. Eric leaned back, staring at the object in stunned silence. Whatever he'd gotten himself into, it was far from over. And somehow, he had a feeling this was only the beginning. Eric sat with his head in his hands, the faint hum of the glowing sphere filling the room like a distant whisper. He had tried everything he could think of to make sense of the projection, recording it, analyzing the tones with some free audio software on his tablet, even playing it backward to see if it spelled out some kind of hidden message. But nothing had worked. It was just him and the glowing alien artifact now, sitting on his coffee table like an uninvited house guest. "Okay," he said aloud, breaking the silence. "This is fine. I'll just wait for the next cryptic light show and hope it comes with subtitles this time." The sphere offered no reply, its glow pulsing gently as if mocking his frustration. Eric got up, pacing the length of his apartment for the 100th time that day. He'd been careful not to leave, partly because he didn't want to risk running into anyone from the facility, and partly because he had no idea how safe it was to leave the sphere unattended. For all he knew, it could sprout legs and walk away the moment he stepped outside. His thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. Eric froze, his heart lurching into his throat. Another knock followed, louder this time. "Eric, you in there?" He let out a shaky breath. It was Paul, his neighbor from down the hall. Paul wasn't exactly what you'd call subtle. He was a big guy with a booming voice and a habit of showing up unannounced, usually with some kind of half-baked scheme or a six-pack of cheap beer. Under normal circumstances, Eric would have just ignored him, but Paul wasn't the kind of guy to take no for an answer. Yeah, I'm here," Eric called, trying to keep the panic out of his voice. "Just busy with work stuff." "Work? On your day off?" Paul sounded skeptical. "Come on, man, open up. I brought pizza." Eric hesitated, glancing at the sphere. The last thing he needed was Paul barging in and asking a million questions about the glowing object in his living room. "Now's not a good time," he said, trying to sound casual. "Maybe later." There was a pause, and for a moment, Eric thought Paul might actually take the hint. But then came the sound of the doorknob rattling. "Your door's unlocked, man," Paul said, his voice muffled through the door. "I'm coming in." Eric's eyes widened. "No, wait." Too late. The door swung open, and Paul stepped inside, holding a greasy pizza box in one hand and a bottle of soda in the other. He froze when he saw the sphere, his mouth dropping open. "Whoa," he said, his voice filled with awe. "What the hell is that?" Eric sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "It's complicated." Paul set the pizza and soda down on the counter, his eyes never leaving the sphere. "Dude, is that like alien tech or something? Did you steal it from work? Please tell me you stole it from work." "I didn't steal it," Eric said quickly. "It was left for me by someone." Paul raised an eyebrow. "By someone? Like an alien someone?" Eric hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. Paul let out a low whistle, walking over to the coffee table for a closer look. "Man, you've got to be kidding me. This thing's the real deal, isn't it? Like Area 51 level real?" "I don't know," Eric admitted. "I think so. She left it for me as a gift or something. But I have no idea what it does." Paul reached out as if to touch the sphere, but Eric quickly stepped in front of him. "Don't," he said firmly. "I don't know if it's safe." Paul held up his hands in mock surrender. Okay. I won't touch your glowing space ball. But you've got to admit, this is pretty freaking cool. You're like, what, a galactic hero now? Saved an alien damsel in distress and got a reward for it? It's not like that, Eric muttered, running a hand through his hair. I didn't do it to be a hero, I just couldn't let her stay there. She looked so… hot? Paul suggested with a grin. Vulnerable, Eric said, shooting him a glare. Paul snorted, flopping onto the couch and grabbing a slice of pizza. Whatever you say, man. So what's the plan? You gonna, call NASA or something? Or are you just gonna sit here and hope it doesn't explode? I don't know, Eric admitted, sinking into the chair opposite the couch. I was hoping it might give me some kind of clue, but so far it's just been glowing and humming. Paul took a bite of his pizza, chewing thoughtfully. Maybe it's waiting for something, like a password or a secret handshake. Eric rolled his eyes. Thanks for the helpful input, Paul. Hey, I'm just saying. Maybe it's not doing anything because you're not doing anything. Eric frowned, looking at the sphere. He hadn't really considered that. Was it possible the artifact was waiting for him to interact with it somehow? Cautiously, he leaned forward, placing his hands on either side of the sphere. Its warmth seemed to increase at his touch, and the humming grew louder, more distinct. Dude, Paul said, leaning back as if expecting the sphere to explode. You sure this is a good idea? Nope, Eric said, his voice tight. The light from the sphere intensified, filling the room with a soft, silvery glow. Eric felt a strange sensation, like a gentle pressure against his mind, as if the artifact were trying to communicate with him. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the light dimmed, and the sphere fell silent. Well, Paul said after a long moment. That was anticlimactic. Eric let out a frustrated sigh, leaning back in his chair. Whatever the artifact wanted from him, it clearly wasn't going to just spell it out. I don't get it, he muttered. What am I supposed to do with this thing? Paul shrugged, grabbing another slice of pizza. Maybe you're overthinking it. Or maybe it's just like a really fancy alien paperweight. Eric shot him a look, but before he could reply, the sphere began to hum again. This time, the sound was different, sharper, more urgent. Eric and Paul exchanged a glance, their unease growing as the light from the sphere pulsed rapidly. Is it supposed to do that? Paul asked, his voice rising. I have no idea, Eric said, his heart racing. The light grew brighter and brighter until it filled the room completely. And then, with a sudden burst, the sphere emitted a wave of energy that sent both men sprawling to the floor. When the light faded, Eric opened his eyes to find the sphere hovering in the air, its glow more intense than ever. Paul let out a shaky laugh. Okay, now it's doing something. Eric could only stare, his mind racing as the artifact began to hum with a sound that resonated deep in his chest. Whatever was happening, it was far from over. The room was a mess of overturned furniture and half-eaten pizza, but Eric barely noticed. His eyes were glued to the sphere, which hung mid-air, glowing with an intensity that seemed to press against the walls of his apartment. The hum it emitted wasn't just sound anymore, it was a vibration that he could feel in his bones. What the hell is it doing? Paul asked, his voice an uneasy mix of awe and fear. He was crouched behind the couch, only his head visible as he peered at the floating artifact. I don't know, Eric muttered, shielding his eyes from the bright light. His heart was pounding, adrenaline coursing through him like wildfire. This is new. The patterns on the sphere's surface began to shift, glowing lines forming intricate shapes that seemed to dance and flow like water. Eric stepped closer, drawn to the artifact, despite the voice in his head, screaming that this was a terrible idea. Dude, don't touch it, Paul called out, his tone rising in panic. What if it explodes, or zaps you, or I don't know, summons an alien death squad? Eric ignored him, his focus entirely on the sphere. The patterns weren't random. They were deliberate, almost like a language he couldn't quite comprehend. As he watched, a single symbol emerged, glowing brighter than the rest. It looked like a starburst, its edges sharp and precise. Then, without warning, the hum stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, pressing against Eric's ears like the aftermath of an explosion. The light from the sphere dimmed, and for a moment he thought it was over. But then the air around him seemed to shift, growing heavy and charged, like the moments before a thunderstorm. The sphere emitted a soft chime, and the starburst symbol projected outward, hanging in the air like a hologram. "What the—" Eric started, but his words were cut off as the projection expanded, enveloping the room in a cascade of light. The apartment dissolved around him, replaced by a vast expanse of stars. He felt as though he were floating in space, the infinite void stretching out in every direction. But it wasn't empty. Shapes moved in the darkness, massive, shimmering structures that seemed to pulse with life. Planets, perhaps, or cities suspended in the cosmos. Eric turned, and there she was. The alien woman stood a few feet away, her silver skin glowing softly against the backdrop of stars. She wasn't a hologram this time. She looked real, solid, her luminous eyes fixed on him with an intensity that made his breath catch. Hey," he said, his voice shaky. "Long time no see." She tilted her head, her expression unreadable. When she spoke, her voice wasn't the melodic tones he'd heard before. It was words, his words. "Eric," she said, her pronunciation halting but clear. "You helped me." Eric blinked, caught off guard. "You can talk?" She nodded slowly. "Learning. Your language. Not easy." "Well, you're doing great," he said, his nervousness bleeding into sarcasm. "Top marks for effort." Her lips curved into a faint smile, and for a moment, Eric forgot about the floating sphere, the holograms, and the fact that he was apparently standing in some kind of intergalactic projection. "You are kind," she said, her voice soft. "Few would risk so much." "Yeah, well," Eric said, rubbing the back of his neck. "I'm not exactly known for my great decision-making, but you looked like you needed help." She stepped closer, her movements fluid and graceful. "You did more than help. You gave me freedom." There was a weight to her words, a depth of emotion that made Eric's chest tighten. He wasn't used to being thanked, especially not like this. "You're welcome," he said, his voice quieter now. "I just couldn't leave you there. It wasn't right." Her glowing eyes seemed to soften, and she reached out, her hand hovering just above his. For a moment, he thought she might actually touch him, but she hesitated, pulling back at the last second. "The sphere," she said, gesturing toward the artifact that now floated between them. "It is a gift, but also a test." Eric frowned. "A test? For what?" "For trust," she said simply. Before he could ask what she meant, the projection began to shift again. The stars around them dimmed, and the shimmering structures faded into darkness. In their place, a new image appeared, a planet bathed in golden light, its surface crisscrossed with rivers of molten silver. "That's your home?" Eric asked, his voice filled with wonder. She nodded. "Erythra," she said. "Once beautiful, now broken." Eric felt a pang of sadness at the sorrow in her voice. "What happened?" "War," she said, her tone heavy. "Greed, fear." The images shifted again, showing scenes of destruction, buildings crumbling, skies darkened by smoke, and figures fleeing in terror. Eric felt a knot form in his stomach as he watched, the weight of her words sinking in. "I'm sorry," he said, the words feeling inadequate. She looked at him, her gaze steady. "Your world is young, but it walks same path." The warning in her tone was clear, and Eric felt a chill run down his spine. "Is that why you're here?" he asked. "To warn us?" To help, she said. If you will. Listen. Eric opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, the projection began to fade. The stars dissolved, the planet disappeared, and he was back in his apartment, the glowing sphere once again resting on the coffee table. Paul was still crouched behind the couch, his eyes wide. What the hell just happened? Eric didn't answer. He was too busy staring at the sphere, his mind racing with everything he'd just seen and heard. One thing was clear. His life had just gotten a whole lot more complicated. Eric sat in the dim glow of the sphere, his apartment feeling unnaturally silent. Paul had finally left, though not without several parting quips about space girlfriends and alien tech treasure hunts. Normally, Eric would have found Paul's banter annoying, but tonight it had been a welcome distraction from the weight pressing down on his chest. Now, though, he was alone. Just him and the sphere, and the echo of the alien woman's words. Your world walks the same path. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees and rubbing his temples. How had his life spiraled into this? A week ago, he'd been an overworked, underpaid technician, keeping a low profile at a government facility. Now he was apparently humanity's liaison to a glowing orb of alien technology and a silver-skinned woman from a dying planet. The sphere pulsed softly, as if sensing his thoughts. Eric shot it a wary glance. What now? You going to lecture me about planetary ethics too? The sphere unsurprisingly didn't respond. He sighed and leaned back against the couch. His mind churned with questions. Why had the alien woman chosen him? Surely there were people better equipped to handle something like this. Scientists, world leaders, anyone but him. He was just a guy who fixed broken machinery and occasionally got yelled at for spilling coffee on important documents. His phone buzzed on the coffee table, pulling him out of his thoughts. He grabbed it, half expecting another text from Paul about how alien tech could probably get you rich if you sold it on eBay. But it wasn't Paul. The message was from an unknown number. They're watching you, be careful. Eric's stomach dropped. He stared at the screen, his pulse racing. Who was this? How did they know about him? About the sphere? His mind jumped to the facility. Had they found out about the escape? Were they tracking him? He glanced nervously at his front door, half expecting a SWAT team to burst in. The phone buzzed again. Don't trust anyone, not even your neighbor. Neighbor? Eric muttered. His eyes darted to the door again, this time with a different kind of dread. Paul was nosy, sure, but he wouldn't, would he? No, it couldn't be Paul. This had to be someone else, someone from the facility, someone who knew what he'd done. His hands trembled as he typed a reply. Who is this? No response. The message hung in the air like a warning, amplifying his paranoia. He set the phone down and stood up, pacing the room. The sphere's glow followed his movements, its gentle pulsing, almost like a heartbeat. Okay, he said aloud, more to himself than to the sphere. Think. If they're watching, that means they know I have you, which means... He trailed off, glancing at the window. The curtains were drawn, but it didn't stop him from feeling exposed. He hurried over and pulled them tighter, then checked the locks on the front door. The sphere hummed louder, drawing his attention. He turned to see it floating a few inches off the table again, its surface shifting with faint, fluid patterns. The same starburst symbol from earlier appeared, glowing faintly. Not now, Eric said, running a hand through his hair. I'm trying to figure out how to not get abducted by shadowy government agents. Can you maybe save the cryptic light shows for later? The symbol pulsed brighter, and the air around him seemed to thrum with energy. Eric froze as a voice filled the room, not the alien woman's voice, but something mechanical, layered, and unfamiliar. Coordinates uploaded. Instructions pending. Eric blinked. Coordinates? What coordinates? Uploaded where? The sphere didn't answer. The starburst symbol faded, leaving him staring at its softly glowing surface. He grabbed his phone again, scrolling through his apps until he found his GPS. Sure enough, A new set of coordinates had appeared in the search bar, as if typed by an invisible hand. The location wasn't far, just outside the city, near an old industrial park that had been abandoned for years. He stared at the map, a sinking feeling in his gut. Whatever this was, it couldn't be good. His phone buzzed again, startling him. Another message from the unknown number. Go, but be ready. He let out a bitter laugh. Be ready for what? Getting ambushed? Kidnapped? Vaporized? The sphere's hum grew louder, almost insistent. Eric stared at it, his mind racing. He didn't want to go. Every instinct screamed at him to stay put, to lock the doors and pretend none of this was happening. But he couldn't shake the feeling that the sphere and the alien woman were counting on him, that whatever was waiting at those coordinates was important. Fine, he muttered, grabbing his jacket. But if I get arrested or worse, I'm blaming you. He pointed at the sphere as if it could understand him, then hesitated. What was he supposed to do with it? He couldn't exactly carry a glowing alien artifact through the city without drawing attention. As if sensing his thoughts, the sphere's light dimmed, and its surface shifted, becoming smaller and smoother until it fit neatly in the palm of his hand. Eric stared at it, his jaw slack. Well, that's convenient. He slipped the sphere into his jacket pocket and headed for the door, his heart pounding. The air outside was cool and crisp, the streets quiet as he made his way to his car. He kept his head down, half expecting black SUVs to come screeching around the corner at any moment. The drive to the industrial park was uneventful, but the tension in his chest only grew. The place was even more desolate than he remembered, crumbling buildings, rusting machinery, and weeds growing through cracks in the pavement. He parked his car and stepped out, the sphere in his pocket growing warmer as he approached the coordinates. The location led him to a building at the edge of the park, its windows shattered and its walls covered in graffiti. He hesitated at the entrance, his instincts screaming at him to turn back, but the sphere pulsed against his hand, urging him forward. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the faint smell of rust. Eric's footsteps echoed as he made his way through the dark, empty space, following the faint glow of the sphere in his hand. It led him to a room near the back, its door half hanging off its hinges. He stepped inside and froze. In the center of the room was a device, massive and alien, its surface covered in the same glowing patterns as the sphere. Wires and conduits snaked across the floor, connecting it to what looked like a makeshift power source. And standing next to it, shrouded in shadows, was a figure. Eric's breath caught as the figure stepped into the light, revealing a familiar face. You, he whispered. The alien woman met his gaze, her luminous eyes filled with a mixture of relief and urgency. You came, she said softly. Before Eric could respond, the device behind her sprang to life, its glow filling the room with a light that seemed to reach into his very soul. The light from the alien device surged outward, bathing the room in an ethereal glow. Eric instinctively raised his arm to shield his eyes, but the warmth of the light wasn't harsh. It was soothing, like sunlight on a crisp autumn morning. The hum of the machine resonated deep within his chest, a vibration that seemed to harmonize with his heartbeat. The alien woman stepped forward, her silver skin shimmering in the radiance. Her expression was calm, though her luminous eyes carried an intensity that made Eric's pulse quicken. I didn't think I'd see you again, he said, his voice shaky. I thought you were gone. She tilted her head slightly, a faint smile playing at the corners of her mouth. I said I would remember you. I do not forget kindness. Her words hit Eric harder than he expected, a warmth spreading in his chest that had nothing to do with the device behind her. For a moment, he almost forgot where they were, almost forgot the cryptic warnings and shadowy threats hanging over his head. But reality came crashing back as the machine's glow pulsed brighter, filling the room with a sense of urgency. What is this thing? Eric asked, nodding toward the device. And why do I get the feeling it's about to change my life again? The alien woman's expression grew somber. It is a bridge, she said. a way to connect my world and yours. Eric frowned, glancing at the intricate patterns etched into the machine's surface. Connect how? Because if you're talking about an alien invasion, I'm going to need a bit more context before I start freaking out. She shook her head. Not invasion. Understanding. My people. We have watched your world, seen its potential, but also its danger. Eric raised an eyebrow. Yeah, well, we're not exactly known for making the best decisions. Your kindness, she said, her gaze steady, is proof that there is hope, that not all paths must lead to destruction. Eric wasn't sure how to respond to that. He wasn't used to being called a beacon of hope. He was just a guy who fixed things and tried to stay out of trouble. But as he looked into her glowing eyes, he realized that she genuinely believed in him, in what he'd done. It was a heavy thing to carry, but somehow it felt right. So this bridge, he said, gesturing to the device. What exactly does it do? It heals, she said simply. Not just wounds or sickness, it heals worlds. Eric blinked, trying to process her words. You're saying this thing can fix what? Our planet? The mess we've made? She nodded. If your people are willing to learn, to change. He let out a low whistle, running a hand through his hair. That's a tall order. Humans aren't exactly great at self-reflection, or teamwork, or not blowing things up. The faint smile returned to her lips. Then they will need you. Eric froze. Me? Oh no. No, I'm not qualified for that. I'm just a guy who stumbled into all of this by accident. Kindness is no accident, she said softly. And sometimes, the right person is not the one who seeks the role, but the one who chooses to act when it matters. He stared at her, at the quiet conviction in her voice, and felt the weight of her words settle on his shoulders. It wasn't fair. He didn't ask for this. But deep down he knew she was right. He had a choice to make, and there was only one answer he could live with. Okay, he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. What do I need to do? The alien woman reached out, her hand hovering just above his. The sphere, she said. It is the key. Eric pulled the glowing orb from his pocket, its warmth familiar against his palm. The patterns on its surface pulsed in time with the machine behind her, as if the two were connected. He held it out to her, but she shook her head. It must be you, she said. The bridge will respond to your intent, your choices. Great, Eric muttered. No pressure or anything. He stepped closer to the machine, the sphere in his hand growing warmer with each step. The glow of the device seemed to reach for the orb, tendrils of light intertwining with its surface. Eric hesitated, glancing back at the alien woman. Are you sure this is safe? He asked. She nodded. Trust yourself. Taking a deep breath, Eric placed the sphere into the center of the machine. The moment it clicked into place, the entire room lit up with a blinding brilliance. He felt a surge of energy rush through him, a connection to something vast and ancient and incomprehensible. Visions flashed before his eyes, images of Earth and its people, of Erythra and its ruins, of other worlds he couldn't begin to name. He saw the beauty and the chaos, the potential and the destruction, and through it all, he felt a thread of hope, fragile but unbroken. The light began to fade, and the room returned to its dim, dusty state. The sphere remained in the machine, its glow steady and calm. Eric turned to the alien woman, his breath ragged. Did it work? He asked. She stepped forward, her gaze full of quiet pride. You have taken the first step. The rest is up to your people. Eric let out a shaky laugh. No pressure there either. She smiled, and for a moment, the weight on his chest didn't feel so heavy. You are stronger than you know, Eric. He opened his mouth to respond, but the air around her began to shimmer, her form growing translucent. He took a step forward, panic rising in his chest. Wait, are you leaving? I must, she said, her voice soft and steady. But the bridge remains. We are not so far apart now. Eric watched as she faded into the light, Her luminous eyes the last thing to disappear. The room fell silent, the hum of the machine a quiet reminder of her presence. For a long moment, he just stood there, staring at the empty space where she'd been. Then he let out a long sigh, running a hand through his hair. "Well," he muttered to himself, "guess I've got some work to do." The sphere pulsed softly, as if in agreement, and for the first time in a long time, Eric felt a spark of something he hadn't realized he was missing. Hope.